Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the treacherous shadows of one of America's most haunting landmarks with 8 disturbing true accounts from the mysterious Skull Cliff region of the Grand Canyon. Each story we explore today has been meticulously documented from the personal testimonies of park rangers, hikers, researchers, and emergency responders who experienced the unexplainable terror that lurks within these ancient stone walls. These are not mere legends passed down through generations, but raw confessions from individuals whose lives were forever changed by what they witnessed in the depths of this cursed canyon territory. From photographers capturing images that should not exist to rescue workers discovering things that defy rational explanation. Tonight we uncover the buried truth about why certain areas of the Grand Canyon remain restricted to the public. To protect the identity and privacy of those brave enough to share their experiences, some names and specific locations have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying reality of their encounters. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what lies hidden in the shadows of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth the next collection of forgotten nightmares. Drop a comment below and tell us about any unexplained experiences you have had in national parks or remote locations. I have been a professional landscape photographer for 15 years, but I have never shown anyone the last photos on my camera from that trip to Skull Cliff. My name is Marcus D'Angelo, and I have traveled across Arizona documenting the raw beauty of our desert landscapes for magazines like Southwest Living and National Geographic. I thought I had seen every angle, every hidden corner of the Grand Canyon region until that assignment in late October changed everything I believed about the places we think we know. The assignment came through my usual contact at Arizona Highways magazine. They wanted a winter feature on the lesser-known areas of the Grand Canyon, specifically focusing on the remote cliff formations that most tourists never see. The pay was excellent, and they gave me complete creative freedom. I had 3 days to capture 20 publishable shots of the Skull Cliff area, a section of the canyon that gets its name from the bone-white limestone formations that jut out like ancient vertebrae along the southern rim. I had researched the area extensively before making the trip. Skull Cliff sits about 40 miles from the main tourist areas, accessible only by a rough dirt road that requires 4-wheel drive and local knowledge to navigate safely. The geological surveys I found mentioned unusual mineral deposits in the rock face that create distinctive color patterns during different lighting conditions. What they did not mention were the strange reports from park rangers about equipment malfunctions and unexplained phenomena in that specific region. I loaded my truck with enough gear for a week-long expedition, even though I only planned to stay 3 days. My equipment included 2 Canon cameras, multiple lenses ranging from wide-angle to telephoto, a heavy-duty tripod, lighting equipment, backup batteries, and enough memory cards to shoot thousands of images. I also packed camping gear, food, water, and emergency supplies because cell phone coverage in that area was non-existent, and help was hours away if something went wrong. The drive to Skull Cliff took nearly 6 hours from Phoenix, with the last 2 hours on increasingly rough terrain that tested both my truck and my determination. When I finally reached my planned campsite, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. The limestone formations really did look like massive skulls emerging from the earth, and I immediately understood why early settlers had given the area such an ominous name. I set up camp quickly and prepared my equipment for the golden hour photography that would begin at dawn. The silence out there was absolute, broken only by occasional wind through the rock formations. I had photographed in remote locations before, but something about Skull Cliff felt different from the moment I arrived. The air seemed thicker somehow, and every sound I made seemed to echo longer than it should have. The first day of shooting went perfectly. I captured stunning images of the sunrise illuminating the cliff face, revealing layers of geological history and the striations of rock. The limestone formations created natural frames for shots of the canyon beyond, and the morning light brought out colors I had never seen in other desert locations. My cameras performed flawlessly, and by noon I had already captured enough quality images to satisfy the magazine assignment. That afternoon I decided to explore deeper into the cliff area to find unique angles for sunset shots. I discovered a narrow ledge about halfway up the main formation that offered an incredible panoramic view of the canyon system. Getting there required some technical climbing, but I had brought rope and safety equipment for exactly these kinds of opportunities. The perspective from that ledge was extraordinary, and I knew the sunset shots would be the highlight of my entire portfolio. As evening approached, I positioned myself on the ledge with my primary camera mounted on the tripod. The light was perfect, and I began shooting as the sun descended toward the horizon. Through my viewfinder, everything looked normal. The canyon spread out below me in all its massive beauty. The rock formations glowed with warm light, and the sky began its transformation through the spectrum of sunset colors. But when I reviewed the images on my camera's display screen, I saw things that had not been visible to my naked eye. In the first few shots, there were dark shapes moving along the canyon floor far below. The shapes were too large to be animals and too organized in their movement to be shadows from passing clouds. They appeared to be human figures, but the scale was wrong. If they were people, they would have had to be at least 12 feet tall to be visible from my position at that distance. I checked my camera settings, thinking I might have accidentally created a double exposure or some other technical error. Everything was correct. I looked down at the canyon floor again, scanning carefully for any sign of movement. I saw nothing but empty desert and rock, but when I took another series of shots and reviewed them immediately, the dark figures were still there, now closer to the base of Skull Cliff directly below my position. The rational part of my mind tried to find logical explanations. Maybe atmospheric conditions were creating some kind of optical illusion that the camera sensor was picking up differently than my eyes. Maybe heat distortion was causing distant objects to appear larger than they actually were. Maybe shadows from the complex rock formations were combining in ways that created the appearance of moving figures. But as I continued shooting, the figures became more distinct and obviously intentional in their movements. They appeared to be climbing up the cliff face below me, though I could see no climbing routes or equipment that would make such an ascent possible. The rock face beneath my ledge was nearly vertical and offered no handholds that I could detect. Yet the dark shapes continued upward, growing larger in each successive photograph. I switched to my telephoto lens to get a closer look at whatever was creating these images. When I zoomed in on the area where the figures appeared to be, I saw details that made my hands shake. The shapes had human-like forms but wrong proportions. Their limbs were too long, their torsos too narrow, and their movements too fluid for normal human anatomy. They climbed the cliff face like spiders, clinging to surfaces that should not have supported any weight. The sun was almost completely set by this point, but I continued taking photographs compulsively. Each image showed the figures getting closer to my position. In the growing darkness, I could finally see them with my own eyes as they approached. They were not human, though they had once been human-shaped. Their skin was the same bone-white color as the limestone cliffs, and their eyes reflected the last rays of sunlight like an animal's eyes in headlights. I had no rational explanation for what I was witnessing. These beings, whatever they were, existed in a way that my camera could detect before my eyes could see them clearly. They moved with purpose and intelligence, and they were definitely climbing toward my ledge. I packed my equipment as quickly as possible, but my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my primary camera twice. The rappel down from the ledge was the most terrifying few minutes of my life. I could hear movement on the rock face around me, the sound of fingernails or claws scraping against stone. But every time I looked toward the sounds, I saw nothing but empty cliff face. My camera, hanging from its strap around my neck, continued to fire automatically as I descended, the flash illuminating the darkness in brief bursts. I reached the bottom of the cliff and ran toward my campsite without looking back. My equipment was scattered and disorganized as I threw everything into my truck, but I did not care about organization or proper packing procedures. I just wanted to get away from Skull Cliff as quickly as possible. The drive back to the main road took place in complete darkness, and I stopped frequently to check my mirrors for signs of pursuit, though I had no idea what I was expecting to see. When I reached civilization and reviewed all the photographs from that evening, I found a complete visual record of my encounter. The images showed the pale beings climbing steadily upward through the growing darkness. The final photographs, taken automatically as I rappelled down, showed dozens of them emerging from cracks and crevices all along the cliff face. They had been watching me the entire time I was up there. I never submitted those photographs to Arizona Highways magazine. Instead, I sent them a selection of the normal landscape shots from earlier in the day and made up a story about equipment problems that prevented me from getting the sunset shots they had requested. The editor was disappointed but accepted the daytime images, which were technically excellent and met their needs for the article. I have never returned to Skull Cliff, and I have never photographed in any remote area of the Grand Canyon region since that trip. The camera that captured those images is locked in a safe deposit box along with the memory cards containing the full sequence of photographs. I know that someday someone will find them and wonder what they are looking at, but I hope that day does not come for many years. The experience changed my entire relationship with photography and with the natural world. I realized that my cameras were capable of seeing things that remained invisible to human perception, and I was not prepared for that level of reality. There are places in this world where the boundary between what we think we know and what actually exists becomes dangerously thin. I still work as a photographer, but now I specialize in urban architecture and commercial photography. I take assignments that keep me in populated areas where strange encounters are unlikely and where help is always nearby if something goes wrong. My colleagues think I burned out on landscape photography or lost my passion for the wilderness, but the truth is much more complicated than professional burnout. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about those pale beings climbing steadily up the cliff face toward my position. I wonder if they are still there, waiting in the cracks and shadows of Skull Cliff for the next photographer or hiker who ventures too far from the established trails. I wonder if my presence there awakened something that had been sleeping in the limestone depths, or if I simply became aware of something that has always been active in that remote corner of the Grand Canyon. What disturbs me most is not knowing whether my camera revealed something that was actually there, or whether the act of photographing that location somehow created the very phenomena I documented. Modern digital cameras are incredibly sophisticated instruments capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation across a broader spectrum than human eyes can perceive. It is possible that my equipment was recording entities that exist in wavelengths of light invisible to normal human vision. But it is also possible that the repeated act of photographing that location created some kind of resonance or disturbance that attracted attention from things that normally remain hidden. Indigenous peoples throughout the Southwest have traditional stories about places where the spirits of the earth should not be disturbed by modern technology. And I have begun to wonder if I stumbled into one of those sacred and dangerous locations. The photographs remain locked away, serving as evidence of an encounter I never intended to have and can never fully explain. They are too clear and detailed to dismiss as technical malfunctions, too consistent across multiple images to explain as coincidental shadows or optical illusions. They document something that challenged everything I thought I understood about the natural world and about the limitations of human perception. I have told this story to no one until now, and I expect that most people will find it difficult to believe. But I know what I saw through my viewfinder that evening at Skull Cliff. And I know what my cameras recorded during those terrifying hours. There are places in this world where our technology reveals more than we are prepared to understand, and sometimes the truth is more disturbing than any fiction we could imagine. I volunteer for Grand Canyon Search and Rescue because I believe everyone deserves to come home. But some people at Skull Cliff do not want to be found. My name is Dakota Williams, and I have been part of the Coconino County Search and Rescue Team for 8 years. I have participated in over 200 rescue operations throughout Arizona, from flash flood evacuations to technical rope rescues on vertical cliff faces. But the mission that took place at Skull Cliff last January changed my understanding of what we are really searching for when people disappear in the wilderness. The initial call came through our emergency dispatch system at approximately 4 in the morning on a Tuesday. 2 separate groups of hikers had reported seeing distress signals from the Skull Cliff area the previous evening, including what appeared to be flashlight signals in a pattern that indicated someone was trying to communicate for help. The signals had been observed between 8 and 10 o'clock at night, coming from a location high on the cliff face that should not have been accessible to recreational hikers without specialized climbing equipment. Our team leader, Captain Sarah Mitchell, assembled a full technical rescue squad consisting of 6 experienced volunteers and 2 professional paramedics. The terrain at Skull Cliff requires advanced rope work and high-angle rescue techniques, so we loaded our vehicles with complete climbing systems, medical equipment, communications gear, and enough supplies for an extended operation. The weather forecast called for clear conditions with temperatures dropping below freezing after sunset, which meant that anyone stranded on the cliff face would be facing life-threatening exposure. The drive to Skull Cliff took nearly 3 hours because we had to transport heavy rescue equipment over rough terrain that tested the limits of our 4-wheel drive vehicles. We established our base camp at the bottom of the main cliff formation and began our assessment of the rescue situation using binoculars and telephoto cameras to scan the cliff face for signs of stranded hikers. The limestone cliffs rose nearly 400 feet above us with multiple ledges and fractures that could potentially shelter someone who had become trapped during a climbing attempt. Using our high-powered spotlights and electronic megaphones, we attempted to make contact with anyone who might be on the cliff face. We followed standard search and rescue protocols, calling out at regular intervals and listening for responses that would help us locate the position of anyone requiring assistance. The echoes from our voices bounced off the limestone walls in complex patterns that made it difficult to determine the direction of any potential responses. But we thought we heard faint calls for help coming from somewhere high on the cliff face. Captain Mitchell deployed our technical climbing team to begin ascending the cliff face using established anchor points and safety systems. I was part of the advance team that would locate and assess the condition of any stranded hikers before the paramedics and additional rescue personnel were brought up to provide medical assistance and evacuation support. The climb to the first major ledge system took nearly 2 hours because we had to place protection anchors and establish safe belay stations as we ascended. When we reached the first ledge, approximately 150 feet up the cliff face, we found evidence that people had recently been in that location. There were scuff marks on the rock surface that indicated foot traffic, and we discovered several pieces of climbing equipment, including carabiners, webbing, and a partially used rope that appeared to have been cut rather than broken under load. The equipment was standard climbing gear, but it had been abandoned in a way that suggested emergency or panic rather than planned retreat. But there were no people on the ledge and no obvious signs of injury or distress that would explain why climbing equipment had been left behind. We used our radio communications to report our findings to the base camp team and continued our ascent toward the higher ledge systems where the distress signals had been observed. The limestone rock was solid and offered good handholds, but the exposure was significant, and the consequences of a fall would be fatal. As we climbed higher on the cliff face, we began to notice unusual characteristics in the rock formations that did not match the geological descriptions in our area maps. There were cavities and openings in the limestone that appeared to be natural caves or passages extending deep into the cliff structure. Some of these openings were large enough for human passage, and they showed evidence of recent use, including footprints in the accumulated dust and debris. The most significant discovery came when we reached the main ledge system approximately 250 feet above the canyon floor. We found a complete campsite including sleeping bags, backpacks, food supplies, and personal belongings that clearly belonged to multiple people. But the campsite appeared to have been abandoned hastily, with gear scattered and personal items left behind in ways that indicated sudden departure rather than planned evacuation. Among the abandoned belongings, we found identification documents belonging to 3 different individuals: Michael Torres from Phoenix, Jennifer Adams from Flagstaff, and Robert Kim from Tucson. According to the dates on their permits and camping receipts, these individuals had been in the area for at least 4 days, which meant they had been camping on the cliff ledge much longer than would be safe or legal without proper permits for extended stays in wilderness areas. But the most disturbing aspect of the campsite discovery was that the sleeping bags and personal belongings showed no signs of struggle or violence, yet the occupants had clearly left in extreme haste. Food was still in cooking pots, personal hygiene items were scattered as if people had been interrupted during normal camp activities, and valuable equipment, including expensive cameras and GPS devices, had been left behind. No experienced backpacker would abandon such equipment unless facing immediate life-threatening danger. We used our radio communications to relay the names and identification information to our base camp team for verification with missing persons databases and Park Service records. While waiting for that information, we continued our search of the ledge area and discovered something that made no sense within the context of a normal rescue operation. We found additional climbing equipment and personal belongings that appeared to belong to different groups of people from different time periods. Some of the abandoned gear showed signs of extended weathering and appeared to have been on the ledge for months or possibly years. There were pieces of clothing, camping equipment, and personal items that represented multiple separate groups of hikers or climbers who had apparently reached this same ledge and then disappeared, leaving their belongings behind. The accumulation of abandoned equipment suggested a pattern of disappearances that had been occurring over an extended period. Captain Mitchell joined our advance team on the ledge and immediately recognized that we were dealing with something far more complex than a routine rescue operation. The evidence suggested multiple groups of missing persons rather than a single emergency, and the pattern of abandoned equipment indicated that people had been reaching this location and then vanishing without explanation. She made the decision to expand our search into the cave openings and passages that we had discovered in the cliff face. The largest cave opening was located at the back of the main ledge and extended horizontally into the limestone cliff for an unknown distance. Using our headlamps and flashlights, we could see that the passage continued beyond the range of our lights and appeared to be a natural tunnel system within the cliff structure. There were definite signs that people had entered this cave system, including footprints, rope marks on the cave walls, and pieces of climbing equipment scattered along the entrance passage. Against standard search and rescue protocols, I volunteered to enter the cave system to search for the missing hikers. Captain Mitchell was reluctant to approve cave exploration without proper spelunking equipment and additional safety personnel, but the evidence clearly indicated that the missing people had gone into the cave passages, and we had an obligation to attempt rescue if they were trapped underground. The cave passage extended much deeper into the cliff than our preliminary examination had suggested. After crawling and climbing through the limestone tunnel for approximately 100 yards, I emerged into a large underground chamber that appeared to be a natural cavern within the cliff structure. My flashlight illuminated a space that was roughly the size of a small auditorium, with a high ceiling that disappeared beyond the reach of my light beam. But the most shocking discovery in the underground chamber was that it contained evidence of long-term human habitation. There were sleeping areas, food storage, water collection systems, and personal belongings that indicated multiple people had been living in the cave for extended periods. The sleeping areas appeared to be occupied, with personal belongings arranged as if the inhabitants had stepped away temporarily and intended to return. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the personal belongings in the cave matched the identification documents we had found in the abandoned campsite on the ledge. Michael Torres, Jennifer Adams, and Robert Kim appeared to have been living in the underground chamber, along with several other individuals whose belongings suggested they had been there much longer. There were personal items dating back months or possibly years, indicating a community of people who had chosen or been compelled to remain in the cave system. But there were no people in the underground chamber when I explored it. The sleeping areas appeared recently used. Food supplies were fresh, and there were signs of ongoing habitation, but the cave was completely empty of human occupants. It was as if an entire community of people had suddenly vanished from their underground refuge, leaving behind all their possessions and survival infrastructure. Using my radio communications, I reported the cave discoveries to Captain Mitchell and requested additional team members to help with the expanded search operation. But as I was preparing to return through the cave passage to the main ledge, I heard sounds that indicated people moving deeper within the cave system. There were voices echoing from passages that led further into the cliff structure, and the voices seemed to be calling for help or trying to communicate. I made the decision to investigate the source of the voices, following additional cave passages that led deeper into the limestone cliff. The passages were narrow and required technical climbing skills to navigate safely, but I could hear the voices becoming clearer as I moved deeper into the cave system. The voices were definitely human, and they seemed to be calling specific names, including some that matched the identification documents we had discovered. But as I got closer to the source of the voices, I began to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was hearing. The voices were calling for help and trying to communicate, but they were also repeating the same phrases and names in patterns that seemed artificial or recorded. The voices lacked the emotional variation and spontaneous quality of people genuinely calling for help, and they seemed designed to lure searchers deeper into the cave system. When I finally reached the area where the voices seemed to originate, I found another large underground chamber that contained no people at all. The voices continued to echo through the space, but there was no source for the sounds that I could identify. The chamber contained more evidence of human habitation, including fresh food supplies and recently used sleeping areas, but it was completely empty of actual human occupants. At that point, I made the decision to retreat immediately back toward the cave entrance and rejoin the main rescue team. But as I was navigating back through the cave passages, I heard new voices behind me that seemed to be following my progress through the tunnel system. The voices were calling my name and asking me to wait or come back. But I had never introduced myself to anyone in the caves, and there was no way that anyone I had not encountered could know my identity. I emerged from the cave system onto the main ledge where Captain Mitchell and the rest of the rescue team were waiting for my report. When I described what I had found in the underground chambers, the team made the immediate decision to evacuate from the cliff face and return to base camp. The evidence we had discovered indicated a situation that exceeded the scope of normal search and rescue operations and required investigation by law enforcement and Park Service authorities. The official incident report documented the discovery of abandoned equipment and evidence of missing persons, but it did not include detailed descriptions of the underground chambers or the community infrastructure we had found in the cave system. The case was referred to the National Park Service for investigation as potential missing persons cases, and the Skull Cliff area was temporarily restricted to prevent additional hikers from accessing the dangerous cliff face. But over the following months, I began to experience persistent dreams and intrusive thoughts related to the voices I had heard in the cave system. The voices seemed to be calling for me to return to the underground chambers, and they provided detailed information about passages and locations within the cave system that I had not fully explored during my initial search. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that I began to question whether my experience in the caves had been entirely real. 6 months after the rescue operation, I learned that 2 other members of our search team had requested transfers to different rescue units and had stopped participating in operations at remote wilderness locations. When I contacted them privately, they admitted to experiencing similar dreams and intrusive thoughts related to the voices from the Skull Cliff caves, and they expressed concerns about the psychological effects of our experience during the rescue operation. I have not returned to Skull Cliff since that January rescue mission, and I now limit my search and rescue activities to locations that do not involve cave systems or underground exploration. The evidence we discovered during that operation suggested that people who disappear in the wilderness do not always want to be found, and that some missing persons cases involve circumstances that fall outside our understanding of normal human behavior. The voices I heard in those limestone caves were calling for help, but they were also calling for something else that I did not understand and did not want to investigate further. There are places in the wilderness where search and rescue operations become something more dangerous than emergency response, and Skull Cliff appears to be one of those places where the people we are searching for may not be the people we ultimately find. Our professor always warned us about staying on designated paths during field studies, but when we found those bone fragments embedded in the cliff face, scientific curiosity overrode common sense. My name is Benjamin Rivera, and I am a graduate student in geological sciences at the University of Arizona. What happened during our field trip to Skull Cliff in December has changed my entire understanding of what lies beneath the surface of our planet, and why some discoveries should remain buried in the depths where they have rested for millennia. The field trip was part of our advanced stratigraphy course, led by Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who has been studying Grand Canyon geology for over 30 years. Our group consisted of 6 graduate students and 2 undergraduate geology majors who had earned spots through exceptional academic performance. The purpose of our expedition was to conduct hands-on analysis of the limestone formations at Skull Cliff, examining mineral deposits and sedimentary layers that represent millions of years of geological history. We were specifically tasked with collecting samples for laboratory analysis and documenting the stratigraphic sequence of the cliff face. Dr. Hendricks had chosen the Skull Cliff location because it offered an excellent cross-section of Paleozoic limestone formations that are not easily accessible at other Grand Canyon sites. The cliff face displays clear boundaries between different geological periods, with fossil evidence embedded in the rock layers that tell the story of ancient marine environments. Our assignment required us to identify and document at least 12 distinct sedimentary layers, collect samples from each layer, and analyze the mineral composition using portable field equipment. We arrived at the base camp area on a Thursday morning in mid-December, when the desert air was cold enough to require heavy jackets but clear enough to provide excellent visibility for our work. Dr. Hendricks established strict safety protocols for our cliff face examination. including buddy system requirements, time limits for individual exploration, and mandatory check-ins every 2 hours. She emphasized repeatedly that graduate research was not worth risking life or limb, and that any samples we could not safely collect would have to be left for future expeditions with more specialized equipment. The limestone cliff face at Skull Cliff rises nearly 400 feet from the canyon floor, with natural ledges and fractures that make it possible to examine different geological layers without technical climbing equipment. The rock is predominantly white and gray limestone with distinctive red and orange mineral staining from iron oxide deposits. What makes this location particularly valuable for geological study is the exceptional preservation of fossil specimens and the clear delineation between different sedimentary periods that occurred when this region was covered by ancient seas. My specific assignment focused on the middle section of the cliff face, approximately 150 feet above the canyon floor, where Permian limestone formations transition into Triassic sandstone layers. This boundary represents one of the most significant geological transitions in Grand Canyon stratigraphy, marking the end of the Paleozoic era and the beginning of the Mesozoic era. I was responsible for documenting this transition zone and collecting samples that would allow us to analyze the environmental conditions during this crucial period in Earth's history. On the second day of our fieldwork, while examining the Permian limestone layer at approximately noon when the lighting conditions were optimal, I noticed something unusual embedded in the rock face that did not match any of the typical marine fossils we expected to find in this formation. The object appeared to be bone fragments, but they were much larger than any known marine organism from the Permian period, and showed characteristics that seemed inconsistent with the geological age of the surrounding rock. The bone fragments were partially exposed in a natural crack in the limestone, appearing to be the remains of some type of vertebrate organism. But according to our geological knowledge, terrestrial vertebrates of the size indicated by these bone fragments should not exist in Permian marine limestone formations. The bones were too large to belong to fish or marine reptiles from that period, and they showed structural characteristics that suggested an adaptation to terrestrial rather than aquatic environments. I called over my field partner, Jessica Martinez, who was working on adjacent sections of the cliff face. Jessica has extensive experience with paleontological specimens from her undergraduate work at the Museum of Natural History, and I wanted her professional opinion before documenting what appeared to be an anomalous discovery. When she examined the bone fragments through our field magnifying equipment, her reaction was immediate concern rather than excitement about a potential significant find. The bone fragments appeared to be humanoid in structure, but scaled to a size that would indicate an individual of extraordinary height and bone density. The femur fragment that was most clearly visible suggested a being that would have stood at least 9 or 10 feet tall when alive, with bone thickness that exceeded normal human proportions by a significant margin. More disturbing was the apparent age of the bones, which seemed to be contemporaneous with the limestone formation rather than a later intrusion into older rock. Jessica and I spent the remainder of that afternoon carefully photographing and documenting the bone fragments without attempting to extract them from the limestone matrix. Our field protocols required that any unusual discoveries be reported to Dr. Hendricks before any collection or removal attempts were made. We used our GPS equipment to record the exact coordinates of the find, and took detailed photographs from multiple angles with measurement scales to document the size and position of the visible bone fragments. When we reported our discovery to Dr. Hendricks that evening during our group debriefing session, her reaction was unexpectedly negative. Instead of the scientific excitement we anticipated, she became visibly uncomfortable and insisted that we had misidentified marine reptile fossils or perhaps encountered bones from a much more recent intrusion into the older limestone. She refused to examine our photographs in detail, and ordered us to focus our remaining fieldwork on other sections of the cliff face. But Jessica and I could not simply dismiss what we had documented. The bone fragments were clearly visible and photographically documented, and our geological training allowed us to distinguish between different types of fossilized remains. These were definitely not marine reptile fossils, and they showed no evidence of being recent intrusions into older rock formations. The bones appeared to be genuinely ancient and genuinely anomalous for their geological context. The following morning, Jessica and I returned to the location of our discovery before the official start of our scheduled fieldwork. We wanted to conduct more detailed examination and potentially collect small samples that would allow for laboratory analysis without compromising the overall specimen. Our plan was to gather enough evidence to support our initial observations and present a compelling case to Dr. Hendricks for official documentation of the find. When we reached the location where we had found the bone fragments the previous day, we discovered that the natural crack in the limestone had been significantly enlarged, apparently by recent fracturing or weathering. More bone fragments were now visible, including what appeared to be portions of a skull that showed both human and non-human characteristics. The cranial capacity suggested intelligence comparable to modern humans, but the overall bone structure was unlike any known hominin species from the fossil record. As we documented these newly exposed specimens, we began to notice other anomalous features in the surrounding limestone. There were carved markings or symbols embedded in the rock face near the bone fragments, appearing to be deliberate engravings rather than natural geological features. The symbols were geometric in nature and showed evidence of being created with tools, but they were clearly ancient and integrated into the limestone formation rather than being recent additions to the rock surface. The most disturbing discovery came when we used our portable ground-penetrating radar equipment to examine the cliff face behind the visible bone fragments. The radar signatures indicated a much larger skeletal structure extending deep into the limestone, suggesting that what we could see was only a small portion of a complete specimen. The radar data showed bone structures continuing for several meters into the rock face, indicating a discovery of potentially enormous scientific significance. But as we continued our unauthorized examination, we began to experience equipment malfunctions that we could not explain through normal technical problems. Our digital cameras began producing images with strange distortions and color anomalies that occurred only when photographing the bone fragments and surrounding symbols. Our GPS unit started giving inconsistent coordinate readings, and our portable radio communications with the base camp became filled with static and interference. More concerning were the physical sensations we began experiencing during our extended exposure to the discovery site. Both Jessica and I reported feeling disoriented and nauseous after spending more than an hour in close proximity to the bone fragments. We experienced difficulty concentrating and found ourselves making basic errors in our documentation procedures that we would never normally make during fieldwork. There was also a persistent sense of being observed or watched, even though we were alone on the cliff face. When we finally returned to base camp and reported our expanded findings to Dr. Hendricks, her reaction was swift and decisive. She immediately ordered the termination of all fieldwork at the Skull Cliff site and began preparations for immediate departure. She confiscated all of our photographic equipment and documentation materials, claiming that they were needed for official review by the university administration. She also made us sign non-disclosure agreements regarding any unusual discoveries made during the field trip. The official explanation provided to the other students was that safety concerns and weather predictions necessitated an early end to the field trip. Dr. Hendricks announced that our remaining assignments would be completed using geological samples from other locations, and that the Skull Cliff site would not be used for future fieldwork due to unstable rock conditions and access difficulties. She emphasized that any student discussion of unauthorized discoveries or speculation about unusual findings would result in academic discipline and potential removal from the graduate program. During our return journey to the university, Jessica and I had an opportunity to discuss our experience privately. We both agreed that our discoveries at Skull Cliff represented something far more significant than normal paleontological specimens, and that Dr. Hendricks' reaction suggested she was aware of similar findings or had been specifically instructed to prevent students from making such discoveries. The non-disclosure agreements and confiscation of our documentation materials indicated institutional knowledge of phenomena that were being actively suppressed. Over the following weeks, Jessica and I attempted to research similar discoveries at other Grand Canyon geological sites, but we found that access to relevant scientific literature was restricted, and that several research papers we attempted to locate had been removed from university databases. Our attempts to contact other geology students who had previously studied at Skull Cliff were unsuccessful, and we learned that the site had been used for student fieldwork only intermittently over the past decade. 3 months after our field trip, Jessica received notification that her graduate fellowship had been terminated due to budget constraints, and she was forced to leave the university program. I received a similar notification 2 weeks later, effectively ending both of our academic careers in geological sciences. Dr. Hendricks avoided all contact with us after our return from Skull Cliff, and our requests for meetings or explanations were referred to university administration officials who claimed no knowledge of our concerns. I have since changed my academic focus to engineering and have not returned to geological fieldwork. Jessica moved to another state and now works in environmental consulting. We maintain occasional contact, but neither of us has attempted to publicize or pursue our discoveries at Skull Cliff. The non-disclosure agreements we signed carry significant legal penalties, and we have no desire to face institutional retaliation or professional consequences for discussing our experience. But I know what we found embedded in that limestone cliff face, and I know that it challenges fundamental assumptions about the geological and archaeological record of the Grand Canyon region. The bone fragments we documented belong to beings that should not have existed during the Permian period according to conventional scientific understanding, and the symbols carved into the rock face suggested technological capabilities that predate known human civilization by millions of years. There are discoveries waiting beneath the surface of our planet that would revolutionize our understanding of history and evolution, but there are also institutional forces committed to ensuring that such discoveries remain buried. The limestone cliffs of the Grand Canyon contain evidence of ancient civilizations and unknown species that existed long before conventional science believed such things were possible. And I suspect that our discovery at Skull Cliff was not unique or unprecedented. The bone fragments are still there, embedded in the limestone cliff face, waiting for the next group of students or researchers who venture into areas they are not supposed to explore. But I doubt that future discoveries will be treated any differently than ours were, and I suspect that the truth about what lies beneath the surface of Skull Cliff will continue to be suppressed by those who have the authority to control access to such information. After 23 years as a Grand Canyon park ranger, I thought I had seen every type of emergency call possible until I got the radio transmission from Skull Cliff sector on November 15th. My name is Linda Mae Patterson, and I have worked for the National Park Service since I graduated from Northern Arizona University with a degree in environmental science. During my career, I have responded to everything from routine medical emergencies to search and rescue operations for missing hikers. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened that cold Tuesday morning when the call came through about the missing research team. The transmission came from Ranger Station 7, which monitors the remote southeastern sections of the park, including the Skull Cliff area. The voice on the radio belonged to Tommy Rodriguez, a newer ranger who had been stationed there for only 6 months. His voice was shaking when he reported that a geological research team from Arizona State University had failed to check in at their scheduled time, and their emergency beacon had been activated but was transmitting from a location that should not have been accessible to anyone on foot. I was the senior ranger on duty that morning, so the responsibility for coordinating the response fell to me. The missing team consisted of 3 graduate students and their faculty advisor, Dr. Margaret Chen, who were conducting a week-long study of mineral deposits in the Skull Cliff limestone formations. They had proper permits for the research area and were experienced in desert survival and technical climbing. Their last confirmed contact had been at 8 o'clock the previous evening when they radioed in their location and confirmed that all team members were present and accounted for. The emergency beacon signal was coming from approximately 2 miles deeper into the canyon than their reported position, in an area that our topographical maps showed as impassable vertical cliff face. There were no established trails or climbing routes that would have allowed the team to reach the beacon's coordinates, and the terrain was considered too dangerous for recreational access. The signal was strong and consistent, indicating that the beacon was functioning properly and had not been damaged or compromised. I assembled a search and rescue team consisting of 4 experienced rangers and 2 volunteer climbers who had extensive knowledge of the Skull Cliff area. We loaded our vehicles with technical rescue equipment, medical supplies, and enough food and water for an extended operation. The drive to the remote access point took nearly 2 hours over rough terrain, and we began our approach to the beacon coordinates on foot at approximately noon. The hike to the general area took another 3 hours because we had to navigate around several sections of unstable rock and loose scree. As we got closer to the beacon signal, the terrain became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The limestone cliffs rose nearly vertical on all sides, and the only way forward was through a narrow canyon that seemed to dead end against the main cliff face. Our GPS units confirmed that we were approaching the beacon coordinates, but visually we could see no way for anyone to have reached this location. When we finally located the source of the emergency signal, we found the beacon device sitting on a narrow ledge approximately 100 feet up the main cliff face. There was no climbing equipment visible, no ropes or anchors that would have enabled someone to reach that ledge, and no obvious route up or down from the position. The beacon was simply sitting there alone, transmitting its distress signal into the empty desert air. More disturbing was the fact that the ledge appeared to be completely inaccessible from any direction we could determine. We used binoculars and telephoto camera lenses to examine the ledge and surrounding area in detail. The beacon was definitely the one assigned to Dr. Chen's research team, but there were no other signs of human presence on the ledge or anywhere in the immediate vicinity. No backpacks, no climbing gear, no personal belongings that would indicate the team had been in that location. The beacon appeared to have been placed deliberately in a position where it would be visible but not retrievable without specialized high-angle rescue equipment. One of our volunteer climbers, Sarah Mitchell, who had been climbing in the Grand Canyon region for over 15 years, examined the cliff face with professional climbing equipment and determined that reaching the ledge would require technical gear and skills that exceeded what a geological research team would normally carry. The rock face offered no natural handholds or footholds, and the limestone was too soft and fractured to support traditional climbing anchors. Even with proper equipment, the ascent would be extremely dangerous and would require multiple experienced climbers working together. We spent the remainder of that day searching the canyon floor and surrounding areas for any signs of the missing team. We found their base camp exactly where their permits indicated it should be, with all equipment still in place and no signs of disturbance or hasty departure. Their research notes were neatly organized, their food supplies were untouched, and their sleeping bags appeared to have been slept in the previous night. Everything suggested that they had simply vanished sometime between their evening radio check and the following morning when they failed to report in. The search continued for 6 more days with additional resources brought in from other Park Service units and local law enforcement agencies. We expanded the search radius to include areas that would have required the team to travel much farther than their research objectives would have necessitated. Helicopters conducted aerial surveys of the entire region, and ground teams covered every accessible square mile within reasonable walking distance of their base camp. We found no traces of the missing researchers anywhere in the expanded search area. On the 4th day of the search, we finally retrieved the emergency beacon from the cliff ledge using helicopter and technical rope rescue specialists. The device was examined by our communications technician and found to be functioning normally with no signs of damage or tampering. The activation log showed that the beacon had been turned on manually at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, several hours after the team's last radio contact. The manual activation meant that someone had deliberately triggered the emergency signal rather than it being activated automatically by impact or water damage. What disturbed me most about the beacon retrieval was something that our helicopter pilot mentioned during the debriefing. He reported that while hovering near the cliff face, his aircraft had experienced unusual electromagnetic interference that affected both his navigation equipment and radio communications. The interference was localized to the immediate area around the ledge where the beacon was found, and it cleared up completely once he moved the helicopter away from that specific location. He had never experienced similar interference during thousands of hours of flying in the Grand Canyon region. The official investigation concluded that the research team had somehow become disoriented and wandered away from their base camp, possibly during the night hours when visibility would have been limited. The theory suggested that they had fallen victim to exposure or accident in a remote area that had not yet been searched, and that the emergency beacon had been activated and thrown or carried to the cliff ledge by unknown means, possibly wind or wildlife. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation with no evidence of foul play, but there were aspects of the case that the official report did not adequately address. The team consisted of experienced researchers who were familiar with desert survival and navigation techniques. They carried GPS devices, emergency whistles, and other safety equipment that should have prevented them from becoming lost in familiar terrain. The condition of their base camp suggested a planned and organized departure rather than a panicked flight or emergency evacuation. Most significantly, the placement of the emergency beacon in an inaccessible location suggested deliberate human action rather than accidental loss or natural forces. Someone had to have placed that device on the cliff ledge, but our investigation found no evidence that anyone with the necessary climbing skills had been in the area during the relevant time period. The electromagnetic interference reported by our helicopter pilot also suggested unusual environmental factors that we could not explain through normal geological or atmospheric phenomena. 6 months after the disappearance, I received an unofficial report from a colleague at Ranger Station 7 that Tommy Rodriguez had requested a transfer to a different park assignment. When I contacted Tommy directly, he told me that he had been experiencing recurring nightmares about voices calling for help from the Skull Cliff area, particularly during the overnight shifts when he was alone at the remote station. He said that the voices seemed to come from the direction of the cliff face where we had found the emergency beacon, and that they occurred most frequently around 3 o'clock in the morning, which was the same time the beacon activation had been logged. I have never filed an official report about Tommy's experiences because they fall outside the scope of normal Park Service documentation. But his account troubled me enough that I began conducting my own unofficial monitoring of the Skull Cliff area during overnight patrols. Over the following months, I made several solo visits to the location where we had found the research team's base camp, usually during the early morning hours when the desert is at its quietest. On 3 separate occasions, I heard sounds that seemed to originate from the cliff face area where the emergency beacon had been recovered. The sounds were difficult to describe precisely, but they resembled human voices calling for help or assistance. The voices were too distant and distorted to make out specific words, but the tone and rhythm suggested people in distress trying to communicate across a great distance. Each time I investigated these sounds with flashlights and binoculars, I found no visual evidence of human presence in the area. The case of Dr. Chen's research team remains officially unsolved, and no trace of the 4 missing researchers has ever been found despite extensive searches and ongoing investigations. The Skull Cliff area has been temporarily restricted to scientific research requiring special permits, and routine patrol coverage of that sector has been reduced due to budget constraints and personnel reassignments. The official explanation for these administrative changes relates to budget priorities and resource allocation, but I suspect that other factors may have influenced the decision to limit Park Service presence in that particular area. I am scheduled to retire from the National Park Service next year after completing my 24th year of service. The missing research team case will probably remain open indefinitely, joining the dozens of other unsolved disappearances that occur in national parks across the country each year. But I know that something happened to those 4 people in the Skull Cliff area that cannot be explained by the standard theories about getting lost or falling victim to natural hazards. The emergency beacon placement, the electromagnetic interference, and the ongoing reports of voices in the night all point to phenomena that fall outside our normal understanding of missing persons cases in wilderness areas. There are places in the Grand Canyon where the combination of geological history, isolation, and unknown environmental factors creates conditions that we do not fully comprehend. And I believe that Skull Cliff is one of those places where our conventional explanations prove inadequate. We came to film a documentary about Grand Canyon legends, but our camera operator started recording things that were not there during our last shoot at Skull Cliff. My name is Jasmine Washington, and I work as a producer for independent documentary films based out of Las Vegas. Our production company specializes in paranormal and unexplained phenomena content for streaming platforms and cable television networks. The project that brought us to Skull Cliff was supposed to be a straightforward exploration of Native American legends and geological mysteries. But it became something far more disturbing than any of us were prepared to handle. The documentary concept originated from research conducted by our director Marcus Chen, who had been studying reports of unusual phenomena in remote areas of the Grand Canyon for over 2 years. Our initial proposal focused on indigenous folklore about spiritual boundaries and sacred sites that should not be disturbed by modern visitors. The network executives were interested in the project because it combined historical research with contemporary mystery elements, and they approved funding for a 5-day shoot at various locations throughout the canyon region. Our crew consisted of 6 people, including myself as producer, Marcus as director, Sarah Mitchell as our primary camera operator, Robert Kim as sound engineer, Jennifer Adams as research coordinator, and Michael Torres as our local guide and safety coordinator. We had extensive experience filming in remote wilderness locations, and we carried professional-grade equipment including multiple cameras, sound recording systems, drone technology for aerial shots, and satellite communication devices for emergency situations. The first 3 days of filming went according to our planned schedule. We documented several well-known legend sites and conducted interviews with tribal elders and Park Service personnel who were willing to discuss the folklore and historical accounts associated with different areas of the Grand Canyon. Our footage was excellent quality, and we were capturing exactly the type of content that our network contacts had requested for the documentary series. Skull Cliff was scheduled as our final location because Marcus wanted to end the documentary with the most visually dramatic and mysterious site we could access within our budget and time constraints. The limestone cliff formations provided an excellent backdrop for our concluding segment about the boundaries between scientific explanation and unexplained phenomena. We planned to spend our final day filming establishing shots, conducting our last interviews and capturing sunset footage that would serve as the closing sequence for the documentary. We arrived at Skull Cliff early on Thursday morning and began setting up our equipment for a full day of filming. Sarah positioned her primary camera system on a stable tripod to capture wide shots of the cliff face, while Robert established his sound recording equipment to document both our narration and the natural acoustics of the canyon environment. The weather conditions were perfect for filming, with clear skies and excellent visibility that would allow us to capture the limestone formations in optimal lighting. The first unusual incident occurred around 10 o'clock in the morning when Sarah was filming establishing shots of the cliff face through her telephoto lens. She reported seeing movement on the cliff face that appeared to be people climbing on areas that should have been inaccessible to human passage. When we examined the cliff face directly with binoculars, we could see no signs of climbers or any equipment that would enable such an ascent. But Sarah insisted that her camera was recording human figures moving across the limestone walls. We reviewed the footage immediately using Sarah's camera display screen, and we could clearly see dark shapes moving along the cliff face in patterns that suggested deliberate climbing rather than shadows or optical illusions. The shapes appeared to be human in form, but scaled to a size that would indicate individuals of extraordinary height and apparent ability to cling to vertical rock surfaces. The footage was technically perfect with no signs of camera malfunction or recording errors. Robert began experiencing audio recording problems around the same time that Sarah was documenting the visual anomalies. His professional sound equipment was picking up voices and conversations that none of us could hear directly. The recorded voices seemed to be speaking in multiple languages, including what sounded like indigenous dialects, but also languages that Robert could not identify despite his extensive experience with international documentary projects. The voices appeared to be having conversations about our presence and our filming activities. Marcus made the decision to continue filming while documenting these unusual phenomena as part of our documentary content. We had been hired to investigate unexplained occurrences at Grand Canyon locations, and we were clearly encountering exactly the type of material that would make our documentary compelling and authentic. We began treating the anomalous footage and audio recordings as legitimate documentation of paranormal activity rather than technical problems with our equipment. But as the day progressed, the phenomena became increasingly intense and difficult to explain through equipment malfunctions or environmental factors. Sarah's camera began recording multiple exposure effects that showed the same locations at what appeared to be different time periods simultaneously. The cliff face would appear in her footage, showing both its current state and what looked like the same location during different historical periods, with evidence of human activity spanning what appeared to be decades or centuries. The most disturbing development came when Sarah's camera began recording people and activities that were clearly not present at our filming location. The footage showed individuals in period clothing from different historical eras, including what appeared to be Native American ceremonies, early European explorers, and groups of people in clothing from various decades of the 20th century. All of these people appeared to be occupying the same physical space as our contemporary filming location, but existing in what seemed to be different time periods. Robert's audio equipment was simultaneously recording conversations and activities that corresponded to the visual anomalies that Sarah was documenting. We could hear voices discussing events and referencing technologies from different historical periods, including conversations that seemed to be occurring in the present day but involving people who were not physically present at our location. The audio quality was excellent and showed no signs of interference or external radio transmissions. By afternoon, our entire crew was experiencing disorientation and difficulty maintaining focus on our planned filming schedule. The combination of visual and audio phenomena was creating a psychological impact that made it difficult to distinguish between what was actually happening at our location and what was being recorded by our equipment. We began to question whether our cameras and recording devices were documenting real events or somehow creating the very phenomena they appeared to be capturing. Marcus attempted to maintain professional filming procedures, but it became increasingly clear that our equipment was recording far more than we had intended to document. The footage showed not only the historical figures and activities I described, but also contemporary people who appeared to be filming crews like ourselves from different time periods. We could see other documentary teams, photographers, and researchers working at the same Skull Cliff location during what appeared to be different decades. The final incident occurred late in the afternoon when Sarah's camera began recording our own crew from what appeared to be different perspectives and time periods. We could see ourselves in the footage, but also versions of ourselves that appeared to be older or younger, wearing different clothing and using different equipment. The recorded versions of ourselves seemed to be aware of being filmed and were looking directly into Sarah's camera despite the fact that we were not posing for those shots. Robert's audio equipment recorded conversations between these different versions of ourselves discussing filming projects and documentary content that we had never worked on. The voices were definitely ours, but the conversations referenced experiences and locations that we had no memory of visiting. The audio suggested that we had been filming at Skull Cliff multiple times over a period of many years, though this was actually our first visit to the location. We made the decision to end filming immediately and pack our equipment for departure. The psychological impact of the recorded phenomena was affecting our ability to think clearly and make rational decisions about our safety and the completion of our project. Marcus was concerned that continued exposure to whatever was causing these recording anomalies might have lasting effects on our mental health and professional capabilities. But when we attempted to leave Skull Cliff, we discovered that our vehicles would not start despite the fact that they had been functioning normally when we arrived. Our satellite communication devices were not receiving signals, and our GPS navigation systems were providing inconsistent location readings. We appeared to be stranded at the filming location with no ability to call for assistance or navigate back to established roads. We spent the night at Skull Cliff using our emergency camping equipment, but none of us were able to sleep due to ongoing audio and visual phenomena that continued even after our cameras and recording equipment had been turned off. We could hear conversations and activities around our campsite that suggested the presence of other people, but visual inspection revealed that we were alone at the location. The sounds continued throughout the night and seemed to be coming from different time periods simultaneously. The next morning, our vehicles started normally and our communication and navigation equipment resumed normal function. We were able to leave Skull Cliff without further difficulty and return to Las Vegas to begin reviewing our footage and planning the editing process for our documentary. But when we attempted to access the recorded material from our final day of filming, we discovered that all of our equipment had experienced complete data corruption. The footage and audio recordings from Skull Cliff were completely unusable due to file corruption that affected every storage device and backup system we had used. Our professional equipment had never experienced such comprehensive data loss, and technical analysis could not identify any cause for the corruption. We lost an entire day of filming and had no usable content from what should have been the most important location in our documentary project. We never completed the Grand Canyon Legends documentary because we could not explain the loss of our Skull Cliff footage to the network executives who had funded our project. The incident effectively ended our working relationship with that particular network, and several members of our crew left the documentary production industry shortly afterward. Marcus now works in commercial video production, and Sarah has moved to still photography rather than cinematography. I have never returned to Skull Cliff, and I now avoid documentary projects that involve investigations of unexplained phenomena or paranormal activity. Our equipment recorded things that should not have been possible, and I suspect that some locations are not meant to be documented by contemporary technology. There are places where the act of filming creates more questions than answers, and Skull Cliff appears to be one of those locations where the boundaries between past and present become dangerously unstable. My grandfather told me stories about Skull Cliff that I never believed until the day I had to guide tourists there and witnessed why our people avoid that cursed place. My name is Thomas Bigay, and I am a member of the Navajo Nation who works as a licensed wilderness guide for tourists visiting remote areas of the Grand Canyon. For 15 years, I have led hiking expeditions, photography tours, and cultural education trips throughout the canyon region, sharing the natural beauty and traditional knowledge of our ancestral lands with visitors from around the world. Growing up on the reservation, I heard many stories from my grandfather about places in the canyon that were dangerous or spiritually significant in ways that outsiders could not understand. He would tell me about locations where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world was thin, and where modern people could encounter things that were not meant for contemporary eyes. I always thought these were just traditional stories meant to teach respect for the land, but I never considered them to be literal warnings about specific dangers. Skull Cliff was one of the places my grandfather specifically warned me never to visit, especially not with groups of tourists who lacked proper spiritual preparation and protection. He told me that the limestone formations in that area contained the remains of ancient beings who had violated natural laws and been imprisoned in the rock as punishment for their crimes against the earth. According to his stories, these beings could influence the minds of people who spent too much time near their stone prison, causing them to see and hear things that would drive them to madness. But as a professional wilderness guide, I could not simply refuse clients who requested trips to specific locations based on traditional stories that I did not fully believe. When the Henderson family from Denver contacted me in March to arrange a 3-day guided tour that specifically included Skull Cliff, I accepted their booking despite my grandfather's warnings. They were experienced hikers who had done extensive research on Grand Canyon geology and were particularly interested in the limestone formations and fossil deposits that made Skull Cliff scientifically significant. The Henderson family consisted of Dr. Michael Henderson, a geology professor at the University of Colorado, his wife Jennifer, who worked as a museum curator, and their 2 teenage children, Sarah and Robert. They were knowledgeable about desert safety and wilderness survival, and they carried professional quality equipment for photography and specimen collection. They seemed like ideal clients who would appreciate both the natural beauty and the cultural significance of the areas we would be visiting. The first 2 days of our guided tour went exactly according to my planned itinerary. We visited several established viewpoints and geological sites where I could share both scientific information and traditional Navajo perspectives on the landscape and its history. The Henderson family was respectful and genuinely interested in learning about indigenous relationships with the land, and I felt comfortable sharing some of the cultural knowledge that my grandfather had taught me about reading the desert environment. On our final day, we hiked to Skull Cliff in the early morning hours when the lighting conditions would be optimal for photography, and when the desert temperatures would still be manageable for extended outdoor activity. I led the family to a safe viewing area approximately half a mile from the main cliff formations, where they could take photographs and conduct their geological observations without venturing into areas that I considered potentially dangerous based on my grandfather's warnings. But Dr. Henderson was not satisfied with observing the cliff formations from a distance. He wanted to collect mineral samples and examine the limestone layers up close, which would require hiking much closer to the base of the cliffs and potentially climbing to reach the most interesting geological features. He had permits for specimen collection and assured me that he had extensive experience with technical climbing in canyon environments. Against my better judgment and despite the persistent feeling that my grandfather's warnings should be taken seriously, I agreed to guide the family closer to the cliff face so that Dr. Henderson could conduct his geological research. We approached the limestone formations using established animal trails that provided relatively safe passage through the rocky terrain, and we reached the base of the cliffs without incident around midday when the sun was directly overhead. The first signs that something was wrong appeared when we were setting up our base camp at the bottom of the cliff. Sarah, the teenage daughter, began complaining of severe headaches and nausea that seemed to come and went without any obvious cause. She had been fine during our morning hike, but as soon as we established our position near the limestone cliffs, she became visibly ill and disoriented. Her mother attributed the symptoms to altitude and desert heat, but I recognized the signs that my grandfather had described as the beginning of spiritual interference. Dr. Henderson began his geological examination of the cliff face, using professional tools to collect samples from different limestone layers and documenting the mineral composition of the various rock formations. But as he worked, he started reporting discoveries that did not match any known geological features of the Skull Cliff area. He claimed to be finding fossil specimens that appeared to be human remains embedded in rock formations that predated human presence in North America by millions of years. More disturbing were the photographs that Jennifer was taking of her husband's geological work. When she reviewed the images on her digital camera, she discovered that the photographs showed additional people working alongside Dr. Henderson who had not been present when the pictures were taken. The photographs clearly showed her husband collecting samples, but they also showed other individuals wearing different clothing and using different tools, as if multiple groups of researchers from different time periods were occupying the same location simultaneously. Robert, the teenage son, began experiencing auditory hallucinations around the same time that his sister was dealing with her unexplained illness, and his mother was discovering the anomalous photographs. He reported hearing voices speaking in languages he could not understand, but the voices seemed to be providing him with detailed information about the geological history of the cliff area and the location of mineral deposits that his father had not yet discovered. I recognized these symptoms as exactly what my grandfather had warned me about, and I knew that we needed to leave Skull Cliff immediately before the spiritual interference became more intense or dangerous. But when I tried to convince the Henderson family that we should return to our established campsite, they were reluctant to abandon Dr. Henderson's research when he was making what appeared to be significant geological discoveries. The situation deteriorated rapidly during the afternoon hours when the sun began casting longer shadows across the cliff face. Sarah's illness became so severe that she was unable to walk without assistance, and she began speaking in what sounded like the same unknown languages that Robert was hearing in his auditory hallucinations. Jennifer's camera continued to record people and activities that were not present, and the photographs began showing the cliff area during what appeared to be different historical periods. Dr. Henderson became completely focused on his geological work to the exclusion of his family's obvious distress, collecting samples and making measurements with an intensity that seemed driven by something beyond normal scientific curiosity. He claimed that the limestone contained evidence of advanced civilizations that predated known human history, and he was convinced that his discoveries would revolutionize understanding of North American archaeology. But the most terrifying development came when I realized that I was also beginning to experience the same symptoms that were affecting the Henderson family. I started hearing voices in traditional Navajo dialect that seemed to be coming from within the cliff face itself. The voices were warning me about the danger we were in and instructing me to use traditional protection ceremonies that my grandfather had taught me but that I had never taken seriously until that moment. Following the guidance of the voices, I began performing a traditional cleansing ceremony using sacred tobacco and prayers that my grandfather had taught me for dealing with spiritual interference. I instructed the Henderson family to gather closely around me and to avoid looking directly at the cliff face while I completed the ceremony. The family was initially skeptical about participating in what they saw as superstitious rituals, but their obvious distress made them willing to try anything that might provide relief. The ceremony worked immediately and dramatically. Sarah's illness disappeared completely, Robert's auditory hallucinations stopped, and Jennifer's camera began functioning normally without recording anomalous images. Dr. Henderson seemed to wake up from his obsessive focus on the geological research and expressed concern about his family's welfare for the first time since we had arrived at the cliff site. We packed our equipment quickly and left Skull Cliff that afternoon, returning to established campgrounds where we spent our final night before returning to civilization. The Henderson family did not discuss their experiences at Skull Cliff during our remaining time together, and they seemed eager to forget what had happened during their geological research expedition. When Dr. Henderson later attempted to analyze the mineral samples he had collected from the limestone cliff, he found that they were completely ordinary limestone with no unusual properties or embedded fossils. The photographs that had shown multiple groups of researchers working at the same location showed only the Henderson family when reviewed in normal lighting conditions. All evidence of their anomalous experiences had disappeared once they were away from the direct influence of the cliff site. I never guided another tour group to Skull Cliff, and I now refuse requests from clients who specifically want to visit that location. My grandfather's warnings about places where the spirit world intersects with the physical world were not traditional stories or metaphorical teachings about respecting nature. They were literal warnings about specific locations where ancient spiritual forces remain active and can influence the minds and perceptions of people who lack proper preparation and protection. The limestone cliffs contain something more than geological formations and mineral deposits. There are places in the Grand Canyon where traditional knowledge and modern science intersect in ways that most people are not prepared to understand. And Skull Cliff is one of those places where our ancestors left warnings that should be heeded by anyone who values their mental and spiritual health. I have free-climbed some of the most dangerous cliffs in North America, but nothing prepared me for what I found in the hidden cave system behind Skull Cliff's rock face. My name is Samantha Mitchell, and I have been a professional rock climber for 12 years. Specializing in technical ascents of limestone formations throughout the southwestern United States. I have conquered vertical walls in Yosemite, completed first ascents in Utah's Red Rock Country, and guided climbing expeditions in remote wilderness areas where few people have ever set foot. The Skull Cliff ascent was not originally planned as part of any official climbing expedition. I was in the Grand Canyon area conducting reconnaissance for a climbing magazine article about undocumented limestone routes when I discovered the cliff formation during a solo hiking trip in February. The limestone walls presented technical challenges that immediately caught my attention, with vertical sections that would require advanced climbing techniques and equipment that most recreational climbers would never attempt. What made Skull Cliff particularly appealing from a climbing perspective was the apparent absence of any established routes or previous climbing attempts. The cliff face showed no signs of anchor points, rappel stations, or the chalk marks that typically indicate where other climbers have attempted ascents. This suggested that I would be making a first ascent of a significant limestone formation, which represents the kind of achievement that serious climbers spend years searching for in increasingly crowded climbing areas. I returned to Skull Cliff 3 weeks later with a complete rack of climbing gear, including ropes, hardware, safety equipment, and enough supplies for a multi-day climbing expedition. My plan was to establish several different routes up the cliff face, document the climbs with photography, and potentially publish the first guidebook coverage of what appeared to be a virgin climbing area within reasonable access of major population centers. The limestone rock quality at Skull Cliff was exceptional, offering solid handholds and reliable protection placements that made the technical climbing both challenging and safe. I completed 2 successful routes up different sections of the cliff face during my first day, reaching heights of approximately 200 feet above the canyon floor and establishing anchor systems that would allow for clean rappel descents back to the base. But during my 3rd route attempt on the main cliff face, I discovered something that was not visible from ground level or from the lower sections of the cliff. At approximately 150 feet above the canyon floor, the limestone formation contained a horizontal opening that appeared to be the entrance to a natural cave system extending deep into the cliff structure. The opening was large enough for human passage, but was positioned in a location that would be impossible to reach without advanced climbing skills. The cave entrance was not marked on any topographical maps of the area, and it showed no signs of previous human visitation despite being located in a region where Native American peoples had lived for thousands of years. The lack of any historical or archaeological documentation of the cave system suggested that it had remained hidden and inaccessible throughout recorded history, making it a potentially significant discovery from both geological and anthropological perspectives. I decided to explore the cave system as part of my climbing expedition, using my technical gear to establish a secure anchor point at the cave entrance that would allow for safe exploration and retreat if necessary. I carried extra headlamps, rope, and emergency supplies into the cave passages, following standard spelunking safety protocols despite my lack of extensive cave exploration experience. The cave passages extended much deeper into the cliff than I had anticipated based on the external appearance of the limestone formation. After crawling and climbing through narrow tunnels for approximately 200 yards, I emerged into a large underground chamber that appeared to be a natural cavern with dimensions comparable to a cathedral interior. My headlamp illuminated smooth limestone walls that rose beyond the reach of my light beam into what appeared to be a domed ceiling. But the most remarkable discovery in the underground chamber was evidence of extensive human modification and habitation that appeared to date back centuries or possibly millennia. The cave walls contained carved symbols and pictographs that resembled Native American petroglyphs, but included geometric patterns and symbolic representations that I had never seen in any archaeological documentation of southwestern indigenous art. More significantly, the chamber contained constructed stone platforms, water collection systems, and storage areas that indicated sophisticated engineering and long-term habitation by people who possessed advanced knowledge of underground construction techniques. The stonework was expertly fitted without mortar, using techniques that matched the precision of ancient Puebloan architecture, but on a scale that exceeded anything I had encountered in documented archaeological sites. The cave system extended beyond the main chamber through additional passages that led deeper into the cliff structure. Using my climbing gear to navigate vertical sections within the cave, I discovered multiple levels of chambers and tunnels that formed a complex underground network. Each level contained evidence of human habitation, including sleeping areas, food storage, tool caches, and elaborate stone carvings that suggested a sophisticated and long-established community. But despite the clear evidence of extensive human occupation, the cave system was completely empty of any contemporary inhabitants. The sleeping areas appeared recently used. Food, storage areas contained preserved supplies, and tool caches included both ancient implements and surprisingly modern equipment. It was as if an entire underground community had simply vanished, leaving behind their entire material culture and infrastructure. The most disturbing discovery came when I reached the deepest accessible level of the cave system, approximately 400 feet into the cliff structure and 100 feet below the original cave entrance. In the deepest chamber, I found evidence of recent climbing equipment, including ropes, anchors, and personal gear that clearly belonged to other climbers who had discovered and explored the cave system before my arrival. Among the abandoned climbing gear, I found personal identification and equipment tags that belonged to climbers I recognized from the professional climbing community. Michael Chen, Jennifer Adams, and Robert Torres were all accomplished climbers who had disappeared during solo climbing expeditions in Arizona over the past 2 years. Their disappearances had been attributed to climbing accidents in remote areas where rescue operations were unable to locate their bodies. But the climbing equipment in the deepest cave chamber was carefully organized and stored rather than scattered, as would be expected from climbing accidents or emergency situations. The gear appeared to have been deliberately cached by climbers who intended to return for it at a later time. Personal belongings, including journals, cameras, and survival supplies, suggested that these climbers had been using the cave system as a base camp for extended periods. The climbing journals contained detailed documentation of routes and exploration within the cave system, describing passages and chambers that extended much deeper than I had explored. The journal entries indicated that the missing climbers had discovered additional levels of the underground complex that contained increasingly elaborate stone construction and carved artwork, representing what they described as an ancient civilization of remarkable sophistication. But the final journal entries from each of the missing climbers described experiences that suggested psychological effects from extended time in the cave system. They reported hearing voices calling from deeper passages, seeing lights and movement in areas where no other people were present, and feeling compelled to explore increasingly dangerous sections of the underground complex despite their concerns about their safety and their ability to find their way back to the surface. The last entry in Michael Chen's journal, dated approximately 6 months before my discovery of the equipment cache, described his decision to attempt a descent into what he called the deepest chamber of the cave system, following voices that seemed to be calling for help from far below his position. His final written words expressed both excitement about making a significant discovery and concern that he might not be able to return to share his findings with the outside world. At that point, I made the immediate decision to retreat from the cave system and return to the surface as quickly as possible. The evidence suggested that other climbers had become lost or trapped in the deeper passages, and I had no desire to add my name to the list of missing persons associated with the Skull Cliff cave system. I left the cached equipment undisturbed and followed my established route back toward the cave entrance. But during my retreat through the cave passages, I began to experience the same phenomena that the missing climbers had described in their journals. I heard voices calling from deeper within the cave system, speaking in languages I could not identify but conveying an unmistakable sense of urgency and appeal for assistance. The voices seemed to know my name and were specifically calling for me to return to the deeper chambers. I also began experiencing equipment malfunctions that had not occurred during my initial exploration of the cave system. My primary headlamp began flickering and producing inconsistent illumination. My backup lights were draining their batteries at an abnormal rate, and my climbing rope was developing frays and weak points that had not been present when I entered the caves. Most disturbing was the growing sense that I was not alone in the cave passages despite having seen no evidence of other people during my exploration. I heard footsteps and movement behind me as I climbed toward the surface, and I frequently felt the sensation of someone pulling on my climbing rope in ways that seemed intentional rather than accidental contact with rock surfaces. I successfully exited the cave system and completed my rappel descent to the canyon floor, but the psychological effects of my underground experience continued for several weeks after I returned to civilization. I experienced recurring dreams about the missing climbers calling for rescue from the deepest chambers of the cave system, and I felt persistent guilt about leaving their equipment behind rather than attempting to continue their exploration. I never published my planned climbing article about Skull Cliff, and I have not returned to the area since my cave discovery. The climbing routes I established on the cliff face represent excellent technical challenges that would appeal to advanced climbers, but I cannot recommend the area knowing what lies hidden behind the limestone walls. There are discoveries waiting in those underground chambers that exceed the scope of recreational climbing activities, and I suspect that the missing climbers found something in the deepest passages that prevented them from returning to share their knowledge with the outside world. I took the overnight security job at the Skull Cliff Research Station because the pay was good and I needed the quiet. But some nights the silence is filled with sounds that should not exist. My name is Raymond Torres, and I have worked as a private security guard for 15 years, mostly at construction sites, office buildings, and industrial facilities throughout New Mexico and Arizona. The assignment at Skull Cliff was different from my usual contracts because it involved protecting a remote scientific research facility, rather than preventing theft or vandalism at commercial properties. The research station was established by a consortium of universities and government agencies to study the geological and archaeological significance of the Skull Cliff area. The facility consisted of 3 modular buildings housing laboratory equipment, data storage systems, communication gear, and temporary living quarters for researchers who needed to stay on site during extended fieldwork periods. My job was to provide overnight security coverage from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 7 days a week, with 1 weekend off per month. The position was advertised as an ideal assignment for security guards who preferred working alone and could handle the isolation of a remote desert location. The pay was significantly higher than typical security work because of the location and the specialized nature of the research being conducted. The contract included housing in a comfortable trailer on the facility grounds, all utilities paid, and access to satellite internet and television for entertainment during the quiet overnight hours. During my initial orientation, the facility manager, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, explained that the research station operated with minimal staffing and that researchers were typically present only during daytime hours. My primary responsibilities were to monitor the perimeter security systems, conduct hourly facility inspections, maintain communication logs, and respond to any equipment alarms or unauthorized intrusions. She emphasized that the scientific equipment was extremely valuable and that maintaining security was essential for the ongoing research projects. The first few weeks of overnight shifts passed without incident. The desert location was indeed very quiet, with only occasional wildlife sounds and the normal settling noises from the modular buildings. I established a routine of hourly perimeter walks, equipment checks, and radio communications with the central monitoring station in Phoenix. The isolation was actually peaceful after years of dealing with urban security problems, and I found the work less stressful than my previous assignments. But as I became more familiar with the facility and the surrounding area, I began to notice unusual characteristics about the research station that had not been mentioned during my orientation. The security cameras were positioned not only to monitor approaches to the buildings, but also to observe specific areas of the cliff face that seemed to have no relevance to protecting the facility. The motion sensors and alarm systems were calibrated to detect activity in areas that were far beyond the normal perimeter of the research station. More puzzling was the discovery that some of the scientific equipment in the laboratory buildings was designed for monitoring and recording rather than analysis or research. There were sensitive audio recording systems with directional microphones aimed at the cliff face, seismic monitoring equipment that seemed designed to detect underground activity, and electromagnetic field detectors that operated continuously throughout the night. This equipment suggested that the researchers were studying active phenomena rather than static geological formations. The first unusual incident occurred during my 3rd week on the job at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night. While conducting my regular perimeter inspection, I heard what sounded like voices calling from the direction of Skull Cliff, about a quarter-mile from the research station. The voices were too distant to make out specific words, but they seemed to be human rather than animal sounds, and they appeared to be trying to communicate or call for attention. I used my high-powered flashlight and binoculars to scan the cliff area, but I could see no signs of people or any other source for the voices. The sounds continued intermittently for about 20 minutes, then stopped completely. I documented the incident in my security log and reported it to the central monitoring station. But I was told that voices in the desert could be explained by wind effects, echoes from distant traffic, or wildlife sounds that can mimic human speech. But over the following nights, the voices became a regular occurrence, always appearing between midnight and 4 in the morning, and always seeming to originate from the cliff area. The voices were sometimes individual calls, sometimes what sounded like conversations between multiple people, and occasionally what seemed to be organized group activities like singing or chanting. The sounds were clear enough that I could determine they were definitely human voices, but I never saw any people in the area during my visual inspections. I began using the facility's scientific equipment to investigate the source of the voices, operating the directional microphones and recording systems during the overnight hours when the sounds typically occurred. The recordings confirmed that the voices were real and not products of my imagination or audio hallucinations caused by isolation and fatigue. But the recorded voices contained characteristics that were difficult to explain through normal acoustic phenomena. The voices appeared to be speaking in multiple languages simultaneously, including what sounded like English, Spanish, and several Native American dialects. But the recordings also captured conversations in languages that I could not identify, and that seemed to follow linguistic patterns unlike any modern languages I had encountered. Some of the voices sounded contemporary, while others had acoustic qualities that suggested they were coming from much greater distances or different environmental conditions. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the recorded voices were discussing the research station and my security activities. The voices knew details about the facility, the scientific equipment, and my daily routines that should not have been accessible to anyone outside the research project. The conversations referenced my name, my work schedule, and my background in ways that suggested ongoing surveillance or monitoring of the facility by unknown individuals. After 6 weeks on the job, I experienced a more direct encounter with whatever was causing the voice phenomena. During my midnight perimeter inspection, I discovered that one of the security cameras monitoring the cliff area was displaying images that did not match what I could see directly. The camera showed multiple people moving around the base of the cliffs, apparently conducting some type of organized activity involving lights, equipment, and what appeared to be construction or excavation work. But when I looked directly at the cliff area using binoculars and high-powered spotlights, I could see no people, no lights, and no signs of any activity. The camera continued to show clear images of people working in the area, while my direct visual observation revealed nothing but empty desert landscape. The discrepancy between the camera feed and direct observation continued for over an hour before the camera images returned to showing the same empty landscape that I could observe directly. I documented this incident in detail and contacted Dr. Hendricks to report the camera malfunction. But she told me that the camera systems were functioning normally and suggested that desert atmospheric conditions could cause optical illusions or recording anomalies. She instructed me to continue my normal security duties and not to be concerned about technical issues with the scientific equipment unless there were actual security breaches or unauthorized personnel on the facility grounds. But during the following weeks, multiple cameras began displaying images that did not correspond to direct visual observation. The cameras showed people, vehicles, structures, and activities in areas that appeared completely empty when observed directly. The discrepancies were consistent across different camera systems and occurred at the same times as the voice phenomena, suggesting a connection between the visual and audio anomalies. The electromagnetic field detectors also began registering significant activity during the same time periods when the cameras and audio equipment were recording anomalous phenomena. The readings indicated electromagnetic disturbances that were much stronger than normal background levels, and that seemed to originate from specific locations around the cliff area. The patterns suggested organized sources of electromagnetic activity rather than random environmental fluctuations. After 3 months on the job, I realized that the research station was not studying geological formations or archaeological sites, but was monitoring active paranormal phenomena that occurred regularly in the Skull Cliff area. The scientific equipment was designed to document and analyze supernatural activities, and my security position was intended to provide protection for researchers who were investigating dangerous or unpredictable supernatural forces. The final incident that convinced me to terminate my security contract occurred during a particularly intense night of voice and camera phenomena. While conducting my 2 o'clock perimeter inspection, I encountered a group of people walking toward the research station from the direction of Skull Cliff. The people appeared to be researchers or scientists carrying equipment and wearing clothing appropriate for desert field work, but they were not scheduled to be at the facility during overnight hours. When I approached the group to verify their authorization to be on the facility grounds, they seemed surprised to see me and claimed they were part of a research team that had been working at the site for several days. They knew details about the facility and the research projects that seemed authentic, but their names were not on any of the personnel lists I had been provided, and they had no identification or documentation that would authorize their presence during secured overnight hours. The group asked detailed questions about my security procedures, my work schedule, and the operation of the monitoring equipment. They seemed particularly interested in the electromagnetic field detectors and the audio recording systems, asking technical questions about the equipment capabilities and data storage procedures. Their knowledge of the scientific equipment was extensive and suggested professional familiarity with the research operations. But when I attempted to contact Dr. Hendricks to verify the authorization of these researchers, my radio and satellite phone systems experienced complete communication failures. The group became agitated when they realized I was trying to contact the facility management, and they began moving toward the laboratory buildings in ways that seemed intended to avoid the security cameras and motion sensors. At that point, I activated the facility alarm systems and demanded that the group identify themselves and provide proper authorization or leave the premises immediately. But instead of complying with my security instructions, the group simply walked through the perimeter fence as if it was not there and disappeared into the desert landscape without any apparent concern about the activated alarms or my attempts to detain them. I submitted my resignation the following morning and left the Skull Cliff assignment immediately. The incidents I experienced during my 3 months at the research station convinced me that some security positions involve protecting against threats that fall outside normal training and procedures, and that the Skull Cliff facility was monitoring phenomena that posed risks to personnel that were not adequately addressed in standard security protocols.